Hello, y'all. Welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, and this is sort of the entry point for the idea of a sovereign state apart from God or the church. And he sort of lays out the obligations that a citizen of a state owe to that state for providing them a system other than anarchy and better than anarchy and made of laws, etc. Okay, so we're going to jump straight into part two of his book, and this is chapter 17 of the causes, generation, and definition of a commonwealth. So I've got a lot of notes here, man. This guy's really long-winded and he touches on all kinds of stuff. So bear with me here, and I'll pause it at some point after one of these chapters and start a new lecture. All right. So basically, Hobbes's argument at its core early in the book is that the natural inclination of mankind and human in general is to dominate and subjugate each other for power and money and glory. And this is invariable, and that we cannot alter our self interested nature without some sort of civilization. And he says that this is to be known as the Leviathan, the state. Because of this natural disposition of humans, a commonwealth is necessary, um, quote unquote, lesser evil, that has to be joined by all for the benefit of all, right? So he's saying, look, I'm not denying the fact that you're going to lose some freedoms, right? When you move from anarchy to a system of laws and justice, inevitably you will lose some freedom, right? Unless you're, um, you know, king 8 foot, 400 pound beefcake, swinging his machine gun around, like um, you're probably not going to be the one who dominates your society, though, right? So he's saying, because of sort of the brutal nature of humankind, we have a lot of incentives to join together to ensure that it's not just power rules all, right? And so we all live in this state of fear and isolation. Um, and he basically says the only way to erect such a common power as may be able to defend them from foreigners. So we need defense, right? And from the injuries of one to another, and thereby to secure them in such a sort as that by their own industry, so by their own works and by the fruit of the earth, they may nourish themselves and live contentedly, is to confer all their power and strength upon a single man or upon an assembly of men that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voice unto one will, right? So we need to come up with a social construct which takes the good of every citizen as its model and empowers an assembly or a king or whatever to carry out that common will, quote unquote. And everyone to own and acknowledge himself to be the author of whatsoever he that so beareth their person shall act or cause to be act in those things which concern the common peace and safety. So, as a citizen, you have an obligation to act in the best interest of your society and therefore to submit their wills, everyone to his will, right? The 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 Leviathan, right? Whatever kind of state, a monarchy, a democracy, whatever, the Leviathan. You have to submit your will to the will of the Leviathan, which is supposed to be conceived of as like the greatest possible action that we could take for the greater good of all man in our nation, and their judgments to be his judgments, right? Okay. Then he says, this is more than just consent or concord, right? It is a real unity of them all in one and the same person, made by covenant of every man with every man in such manner as if every man should say to every man, I authorize and I give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men on this condition that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner. So I'm saying, I'm going to, I have an incentive. I'm going to agree to give up my power over some actions of my life, so long as you will do the same. This done, the multitude so united in one person is called the Commonwealth, right? And in Latin, he says it's called the civitas. He goes on, he says, this is the generation of that great Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God to which we owe under the immortal God our peace and defense. So he's even saying that the state is unto godliness, basically. It's much more than just a man or a construct or an institution, right? It is the God on earth, basically, of politics. For by this authority given him by every particular man in the commonwealth, he hath the use of so much power and strength conferred on him that by terror thereof he is enabled to form the wills of them all, to peace at home and mutual aid against enemies abroad. And in him consisteth the essence of the commonwealth, which, to define it, is one person, of whose acts a great multitude, by mutual covenants one with another, have made themselves every one the author, to the end he may use the strength and means of them, as he shall think expedient for their peace and common defense. So we're all giving up our overall agency for the common good of our society to the Leviathan or the Commonwealth, quote unquote. Again, he keeps saying into this person, but he doesn't necessarily just mean a king, right? He means an assembly of people, a king, whatever it could be, whatever form it takes. We're still making this social compact, basically. Okay, and then he outlines two different kinds of a commonwealth. The first is a commonwealth by acquisition, right? And this is basically conquerors. It is a commonwealth made by force, wherein men are made to bow and to accept the agreement of a king because they will be killed if they do not. Or their wives will be taken, or their children will be slaughtered, or whatever it may be. That is not what he is talking about. That is a commonwealth, but he says that's not what we're looking for here, right? It's not, while there may be laws and there may be law rather than lawlessness in our society or in our geographical territory, this isn't the compact that citizens would make to their leader or state, right? This is just being caused by power and fear, right? Rule by the sword. And then the second one is the commonwealth by institution, and this is one that he wants to talk about. And he says, when men agree amongst themselves to submit to some man or some assembly of men voluntarily, on confidence to be protected by him against all others, foreign and domestic. All right. So that is the very basic construct of what he's talking about, what the Leviathan is, what the Commonwealth is, which are basically interchangeable. Okay, so we'll do one more chapter, and then I'll stop it and we'll start another one. So this is chapter 18. It's XVIII for those of you who don't do Roman numerals. Of the rights of sovereigns by institutions. And he says basically, quote, everyone, as well he that voted for it as he that voted against it, shall authorize all the actions and judgments of that man or assembly of men in the same manner as if they were his own, to the end to live peaceably amongst themselves and be protected against other men. So he's basically saying, like, there are laws that will be constructed that are for the greater good that you're not going to vote for, but you're still obligated to live under those rules. And we'll talk about the problems that some of that stuff can cause, like tyranny of the majority, the generational problem, things of that sort. Um, and quote, and consequently, they that have already instituted a commonwealth, being thereby bound by covenant to own the actions and judgments of one, cannot lawfully make a new covenant amongst themselves to be obedient to any other, if anything whatsoever, without his permission. So only the state can release you from your obligation to the state as a citizen. So uh, then he basically lays down a lot of rules for why the citizen has to respect the sovereign, right? In every decision. Okay, so first, he says that citizens do not have a right to rebel against the state without the permission of their current sovereign, which is problematic, right? And my question to you is how do you feel about this, right? Um, this also has a generational problem, right? People who wrote laws, like, today, Gen Z or millennials or whatever, are a little frustrated with the laws that the boomers and beyond wrote in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, whatever, under a very different view of what society was and what the state's role was, and what the rights of particular citizens, like black and brown citizens, were. Um, and so, are we obligated as youth who disagree and didn't really agree to the social contract to begin with, have a right to question it, right? Um, and they also that Hobbes also goes on and says that to depose a leader is to break the covenant, and that the sovereign is, quote unquote, the citizen. So by deposing the sovereign, you're deposing yourself, right? Okay, so number two, because citizens decided to choose the sovereign and not the other way around, which is questionable, right? Uh, the sovereign cannot, quote unquote, breach his covenant. Only citizens can. So he's basically suggesting the idea that the king or the sovereign in general is not, the rules are not applicable to them. The laws are not applicable to them. They are above the laws. Only the citizens have to follow those laws, and the kings who create them are divested from them. That's a real problem we'll talk about later too, and that's a huge criticism that in the next section Jean-Jacques Rousseau lays upon Thomas Hobbes. Okay, number three. Because some majority has consented to a particular sovereign, all others in the geographical territory must agree by default. And again, I have major problems with this, right? This has some issues like tyranny of the majority. It also has issues with colonialism, right? If you're a colony of some king, are they citizens or do they have the right of independence? And this is all sort of pre-independence, especially of the British colonies, right? Which didn't fall until the mid 20th century, 1950s, 1960s, etc. Most of their empire didn't fall until that time. And so this is way, way before that. But in a sense, later in the book, he is clearly and overtly, I would say, supporting colonialism. So that's not great. Okay. Point number four, he kind of goes back to point number two, saying that the king can't be held to the same standard as citizens. Point number five, sovereigns cannot be punished or executed because of the four former rules. So this is where he's saying, like, those guys are above the law, right? They're Judge Dredd for those of you who who read comic books, right? I am the law. Point number six is that sovereigns have a duty to keep the peace and therefore have the legitimate claim to censor publications that might cause discord. And so this is a really, really touchy one for later philosophers, and especially the American founders, and then some of the French revolutionists during the Terror, was the idea of the state being allowed to censor information that they thought was, quote unquote, unpatriotic or whatever. But right, while it may be unpatriotic sometimes it's real criticism of a state that deserves a real criticism, right? And so that's why most modern societies have a very, very strong sense of freedom of the press. America probably has the biggest freedom of speech on the planet, but there are at least very strong supports for freedom of the press across the Western world, and in places like Japan, South Korea, etc. Um, so, the idea that the king or the government can completely censor anything that before it comes out for the quote unquote public good is a really problematic thought. Okay, number 7. The sovereign has the right to pass laws to keep the peace and ban particular substances. So the sovereign gets to decide like what can be grown within the borders, what kind of, I guess, drugs can be used, or, can you drink alcohol? Also, what can be sold, what can be imported and exported, all of that kind of stuff. So, like, complete control over the market. Number 8, the sovereign has the right to hear and decide all legal cases. So he's not only the legislature, but also the executive and the judicial system, and he's above the law. So again, I mean, this guy is really stacking up, quote unquote, the Leviathan, right? Like this incredibly powerful beast that's supposed to become part of how you think about this. Okay. Part 9. The sovereign is the commander in chief and decides issues of peace and war. And then he also, like, quietly slips in the power to tax citizens. While he doesn't state it as one of his points, he says that the king has a right to tax citizens to pay for war, right? So this is a very encompassing point, number 9. You're the commander in chief. You run all of the foreign policy and diplomacy and war, and you can tax your citizens, right? So bunch of different stuff going on there. Number 10, the sovereign has the right to pick all political and military leaders, right? So the power of appointment. So under such a system, I mean, you would never really have someone to point back or to criticize or to sometimes even give realistic information, right? Like we know happened to Hitler toward the end of his regime. His military and political allies were so scared of him that no one would speak up and say, "We've lost. This is insane." Um, okay, let's see. Number 11. The sovereign has the right to reward or to punish for, I guess, benefiting or not benefiting society. So he's talking about like granting titles of nobility and stuff like that. And then number 12, yeah, he can hand out titles. Okay, so Hobbes sort of knows that this is a lot of power, but he is suggesting that this is still better than the alternative. I would suggest that that's a Manichaean perspective, right? A very dichotomous, bivariate perspective. It's either anarchy or it's this overpowerful state that controls all actions, right? Um, I think he set it up in a very logically inconsistent way and was kind of um, inconsiderate about the middle ground, right? So, anyway, he says, whereas the power in all forms, if they be perfect enough to protect them, is the same, not considering that the estate of man can never be without some incommodity or other, and that the greatest that in any form of government can possibly happen to the people in general is scarce sensible. In respect of the miseries and horrible calamities that accompany civil war, or that dissolute condition of masterless men without subjugation to laws and coercive power to tie their hands from rapine and revenge. So, he's saying if this completely overpowering Leviathan state doesn't exist, that your society is inevitably going to break down and then you'll have civil war. And that, I mean, he even says here, like, people are going to get raped and there's going to be revenge. Like, it's like, dude, wow, okay. So he's using some pretty strong language. All right, so we'll cut it there and then we will start on chapter 19 in the next one. So thank you so much for being with me, and I'll see you for the next one. Have a great day.